Clara Vent came for the wood on the morning of January 11th with the particular expression of a woman who has decided that borrowing is a perfectly acceptable word for what she is doing. She came without her husband Wilhelm, which told Lena Schubert something, because Wilhelm Vent was a man who managed difficult conversations by not being present for them. He had sent Clara with a basket and the story about the splitting mall handle breaking, which was a reasonable misfortune, but not, Lena had noticed, the kind of misfortune that prevented a man from asking his neighbors himself. The temperature was -8. It had been -8 or colder for 11 consecutive days, which was the longest continuous below-zero stretch anyone in the Kaskaskia Bottom settlement had recorded in 22 years of record-keeping at the Schreiber store, and which had done to the settlement's firewood what sustained -8 always did to firewood that was stored in the standard way, which was stacked in rows against the south wall of the cabin or under the lean-to roof, bark up, in the way that everyone stacked. Wood, because it was the way everyone had always stacked wood. What -8 did to improperly dried wood was freeze it. Not freeze it in the way that frozen ground froze, not solid and structural. Freeze it in the specific way of wood that had been stored with too much moisture in it. The water in the outer wood cells and in the cracks and the gaps between the stacked pieces crystallizing into ice that bonded the pieces to each other and to the ground beneath them in a mass that required an axe and considerable effort to separate into burnable pieces. The Vent woodpile had been bonded in this way since the 3rd day of the cold snap. Wilhelm had been chipping at it each morning with the axe he had been using because the splitting maul handle had broken, and the work was producing less than a day's burning each morning and taking an hour to do it. Clara stood at Lena Schubert's door with the basket. She said, "Wilhelm's maul handle broke in the cold, and I was wondering if you might spare some wood until he can get to the smithy." Lena said, "Come around." She led Clara around the east side of the cabin to the woodshed, which was not adjacent to the cabin in the way that most settlement woodsheds were adjacent, tight against the south wall for convenience, but was set 20 feet away from the cabin on its own post foundation, facing north-south rather than east-west, open on 2 sides at the slatted board walls rather than solid. Clara had seen the woodshed before. She had thought it was peculiar when Lena built it 2 summers ago, had said so to other women at the sewing circle, had participated in the general observation that a woman whose husband was away for months at a time could be forgiven for making odd decisions about outbuildings, and had meant none of this unkindly, or not primarily unkindly, but as the honest assessment of a community that had certain standards about how things were done, and was noting that those standards were not being followed. Now Clara looked at the woodshed in -8 air and felt something she did not immediately identify. Lena opened the shed door. Clara stepped in. The wood was not frozen. This was the fact that arrived first, before any evaluation or analysis. The wood was not frozen. The pieces in the nearest stack, which Clara had moved toward without thinking, were individually separable, individual pieces of split oak and ash lying in their stacked rows, without the ice bonding that had been making the Vent woodpile a solid mass since day 3 of the cold snap. She picked up a piece. It came free without resistance. She held it in her hand. It was light. She turned it in her hands the way people turned things they were trying to understand through their fingers. The split face was pale, almost white in the grey January light through the slatted walls. The wood was light, the way dry wood was light. Lighter than you expected, lighter than the equivalent piece from her own pile, lighter by the specific fraction that represented the absence of the water that was currently holding her own wood together in a frozen block outside her cabin. She said, "It's not frozen." Lena said, "No." She said, "Why?" Lena said, "Because it's dry." Clara held the piece of ash and looked at the rows of wood around her, and did not say anything for a moment, because she was a practical woman and she was working through the practical implications of what she was holding, which was wood that burned at full efficiency, wood that started on the first match and held temperature and did not hiss and did not require constant feeding and did not freeze into a mass that required an axe and an hour of work to separate in -8 air. She said, "What is your wood consumption this month?" Lena looked at her. It was not the question she had expected. She said, "Less than 2/3 of a cord so far. I expect to finish the month at perhaps 3/4. Clara said, "Wilhelm has burned through 1 1/3 cord in 11 days. Lena said nothing. Clara said, "His wood is wet." Lena said, "His wood is the same wood everyone in the settlement has. Cut in October or November, stacked against the cabin wall, used through the winter. Is always wet in January." Clara said, "And yours is not." Lena said, "Mine has been properly dried since September." Clara set the piece of ash back in the stack. She looked at the slatted walls, which were not solid like standard woodshed walls, but built from boards, with 2-inch gaps between them running the length of the shed on both the east and west faces. She looked at the elevated floor, which was not on the ground but set on wooden posts 4 inches off the ground, the floorboards running perpendicular to the wind direction outside. She looked at the north-south orientation of the structure, perpendicular to the east-west prevailing wind, the open slatted sides facing directly into and out of the wind rather than parallel to it. She said, "You built this to dry wood." Lena said, "I built it to store wood correctly." Clara said, "It is a drying shed." Lena said, "It is a properly oriented woodshed with adequate ventilation." Clara said, "In 2 summers you have not explained this to anyone." Lena said, "I have tried." Clara was quiet for a moment. Lena said, "At the sewing circle in September 2 years ago, I explained to 4 women, including yourself, why this shed would produce drier wood than a standard lean-to construction. I was told it looked cheap and that the gaps in the walls would let snow in. Both of those things are true, and neither of them is the relevant consideration." Clara looked at the gaps in the walls. There was snow on the inner surfaces of the boards near the gaps, yes. The wood inside was dry, yes. She said, "Take your wood." Lena brought a canvas sack to the back of the shed and filled it with 6 days' worth of ash and oak from the front stack, which was the stack she had designated for current use, the wood that had been in the shed longest and was driest. She handed the sack to Clara. Clara said, "What do I owe you?" Lena said, "Come to the sewing circle on Thursday. Bring Marta Hofer and Hannelore Brecht if they will come. I want to explain the shed properly, with people standing in it, rather than in description." Clara looked at her. Lena said, "I have 7 cords in this shed, 7 cords of properly dried wood that I can burn at full efficiency through the worst winter this settlement has seen in 22 years. I have more than I need, and there are families in this settlement who are already managing a wood crisis. Thursday is the practical choice." Clara said, "Wilhelm will say." Lena said, "Wilhelm can say what he will say. I am asking you." Clara took the sack of wood and went home. This is the story of how Lena Schubert, a 38-year-old German immigrant woman on an Illinois territory claim, in the winter of 1852, built a woodshed that the settlement's women called cheap and useless, and that held 7 cords of bone-dry firewood through the hardest cold snap in 22 years, while every other family in the Kaskaskia bottoms chipped frozen wood with an axe each morning and burned through their supply at the rate of wet wood, fighting a fire that never quite caught. Improperly, Lena had come from Württemberg in 1838 with her parents and her younger sister, 14 years old, the specific age at which immigration imposes itself as an understanding of the world, rather than merely as a change of location. She had grown up in her father's cooperage, in the smell of wood and the sound of wood, and the knowledge of wood as a material with properties that could be understood and worked with and used correctly or used incorrectly, and the difference between correct and incorrect in cooperage was visible and immediate and educational. Wood that was not properly seasoned cracked and warped and leaked. Wood that was properly seasoned was stable and strong and did what you wanted it to do. This was the fundamental truth of cooperage, and Lena had understood it at 14 and had never found reason to revise it. She had married Gerhard Schubert in 1843, a miller's apprentice who had become a traveling miller by 1848. Following the circuit of grist mills that the settlements of the Illinois and Indiana territories required as they grew and as the original mill owners aged, and their mills required the services of an experienced man who knew how to keep a millstone dressed and a sluice gate functioning. Gerhard was on the road from April through August each year, sometimes longer, and Lena managed the claim during those months with the systematic attention of a woman who had decided that systematic attention was what the situation required. What the situation required in the early years was a great deal of firewood cut and stored by two people, one of whom was present for only part of the cutting season. Gerhard cut what he could before he left in April and after he returned in August and through September, and Lena cut what she could during the summer months using the two-man crosscut saw alone, which was slower but not impossible. They had been cutting and storing approximately 8 cords per year and burning approximately 7 cords per winter, which was the consumption rate of a standard construction claim cabin in an Illinois Territory winter. 8 cords cut and stored, 7 burned. 1 cord margin. The margin was not comfortable. The margin was the arithmetic of a household that was always approximately right, but not generously so. Lena was not a woman who was comfortable with approximately right. She wanted to understand the problem completely enough to solve it rather than manage it. The problem was not the cutting. 8 cords was an achievable cutting target for 2 people working efficiently, and she and Gerhard could manage it. The problem was the burning rate. 7 cords was the burning rate for wet wood in a standard cabin. She had kept records since the first winter in their own cabin, the winter of 1844 to 1845, and the records were specific. In January and February, when the outdoor wood had been through 2 or 3 months of freeze-thaw cycling, the fire consumed approximately 40% more wood per degree of temperature maintained than it consumed in December with fresher stored wood. The December wood was never truly dry, but it was less wet than the January wood, and the fire reflected this. She had read about this. She was a woman who read in German and increasingly in English, and she read what she could find about the things she was trying to understand. She had found, in the library of the county seat that she visited when she went for supplies, a German-language farming and homesteading manual published in Stuttgart in 1839 that contained a chapter on wood storage that was the most useful thing she had read on the subject. The chapter described what the author called the fundamental error of Northern European wood storage, which was the belief that protecting wood from rain and snow was the primary challenge of winter storage. It was not. The primary challenge was moisture cycling, the alternating saturation and partial drying that occurred when stored wood was exposed to temperature variations. Each cycle drove moisture deeper into the wood fiber, and no amount of surface drying could remove moisture that had penetrated to the center of the piece. Wood that had cycled 10 times between freezing and thawing had moisture in its center that only sustained heating in a dedicated wood-drying facility could remove. The solution the author described was specific and mechanical. Wood stored for winter burning needed to be dried during the warm months, when heat and airflow could remove the free moisture from the wood cells before the first freeze locked it in. The drying required 2 things in combination: warm temperatures and continuous airflow. Warm temperatures drove the moisture from the wood cells outward. Airflow carried the moisture away from the wood surface before it could reabsorb from the surrounding air. A woodshed that accomplished this would need to be oriented to catch the prevailing wind on its open faces, which meant the open faces should be perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction, not parallel to it. A shed with its long axis running east-west and its open sides facing north and south would intercept none of the prevailing southwest wind. The same shed turned 90 degrees, its long axis running north-south and its open sides facing east and west, would present its full face to the prevailing southwest wind, moving through from west to east, drawing the airflow through the entire depth of the stacked wood. She had read this and understood it immediately, the way you understood something that confirmed what you had partly known before. She had spent 2 winters in their claim cabin watching the fire fight wet wood, and had known the wood was wet, and had not known the specific mechanism by which it became wet, and had not known the specific intervention that could prevent it. The Stuttgart manual gave her the mechanism and the intervention. The elevated floor was part of the same system. Ground moisture wicked upward through the bottom layer of any wood stack in contact with the ground, and the bottom layer communicated its moisture to the layer above it, which communicated to the layer above that. A stack of wood in contact with the ground was a stack of wood being irrigated from below. Raising the floor 3 to 5 inches off the ground on posts, with a floor of boards running perpendicular to the direction of airflow so that air could move under the stack as well as through it, broke the ground moisture connection and added a lower airflow channel that worked through the entire height of the stack. She'd built the shed in June of 1850 when Gerhard was on the road. She built it alone, which she had done with most of the construction on their claim, using the same systematic approach she used for all difficult projects, starting with the design on paper, sourcing the materials in advance, and doing the work in the specific sequence that the design required. The slatted walls had been the part that required the most deliberate thought. Solid walls like those of a standard outbuilding would prevent the critical airflow. But open walls, fully open, would expose the wood to precipitation and to the direct wind chill that could cool the wood below the temperature at which drying occurred efficiently. The Stuttgart manual specified slatted walls with gaps approximately 1/4 to 1/5 of the total wall surface, which allowed substantial airflow while limiting precipitation entry and wind chill effect. She had cut the boards herself from the oak she had taken from the creek bottom the previous autumn, sawing them to consistent widths with the rip saw that was the slowest and most tedious of the cutting tools she used, but the only one that produced the precise widths required. The boards were 1 inch thick, 4 inches wide, spaced at 2-inch intervals, nailed to the post frame. The 2-inch gaps were close enough to shed most of the precipitation, while wide enough to maintain the airflow that the drying principle required. The wood she stacked in June of 1850 for the winter of 1850 to 1851 was cut in April and May. Green wood from the creek bottom timber, oak and ash and hickory. By September, after 4 months of summer airflow through the slatted walls, the wood had dried to a moisture content she estimated by pressing her thumbnail firmly into a freshly split cross-section. Properly dried wood, below 20% moisture, showed a thumbnail impression that held its shape without expressing visible moisture at the edges. Green wood showed a mark with glistening edges from expressed moisture. Her September wood showed the dry impression. She burned it through the winter of 1850 and kept the same record she had kept before. The comparison was clear. December consumption, the month when the cabin was heating against the first serious cold with the well-dried wood, was 38% lower than the previous December with standard outdoor stored wood. January was 42% lower. February was 51% lower, because by late February, the standard outdoor wood had been through the most cycles and was at peak wet, while her shed wood had maintained its dried condition through the stable temperature and limited precipitation of its slatted enclosure. She showed these numbers to Gerhard when he came home in August of 1851, and he looked at them for a long time and said, "This is very good." She said, "I want to explain it to the settlement women at the sewing circle." He said, "They will have questions about the shed walls." She said, "They will say the walls look cheap." He said, "Will they?" She said, "The gaps in the walls look like the structure was built incompletely. The standard expectation is solid walls on an outbuilding. The gaps look like a mistake." He said, "But they are not a mistake." She said, "No, they are the most important part, but they look like a mistake to someone who does not know what they are looking at." He said, "Explain it." She said, "I have explained it 3 times at Sewing Circle and once to Clara Vent directly. The explanation has not produced the result of anyone building a shed this way." He said, "Why not?" She said, "Because the explanation comes from me and they can see the shed from the road and it looks cheap. The cheap shed and the explanation from the woman whose husband is away all summer add up to the same conclusion for the settlement. An odd woman making odd decisions." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What produces the result then?" She said, "January." She said this with the calm certainty of a woman who had thought about it clearly and had arrived at a conclusion she was comfortable waiting for. January was the argument she could not make in September, but that the winter would make for her if she was patient and ready. The winter of 1852 was the argument. The cold snap that arrived on January 1st and held through the 11th was the specific argument she had predicted, because sustained below-zero temperatures were the condition that made the difference between properly dried wood and improperly stored wood, visible and immediate and impossible to ignore. Wet wood froze. Dry wood did not. The distinction was not a matter of degree or of management or of skill. It was a matter of physics. And -8 for 11 days was sufficient physics to demonstrate the point without any additional commentary from Lena Schubert. She had spent the first 10 days of the cold snap watching the settlement's wood situation develop the way she had expected it to develop, through the informal network of observation and conversation that connected the Kaskaskia Bottoms families across their quarter-mile intervals of prairie. The bent woodpile had bonded on day 3, which she had predicted internally because the vent wood was always cut late and stacked immediately without the drying period that the summer airflow required. The Brecht family had been managing a partially frozen pile since day 5. The Zimmermann claim, which was the most exposed to the northwest wind and which had the least sheltered wood storage, had been chipping frozen wood since day 2. She had considered going to each family and offering wood before they came to her, but had decided against it, not from withholding or from the satisfaction of being proved right, but from a more practical analysis. The settlement families would not hear what she had to say about the shed while they were not yet in a situation that required them to listen. They would hear it when they were in the situation, when they were standing in her shed holding a piece of bone-dry ash, and the comparison with their own frozen pile was not abstract, but immediate and personal. January 11th was the day Clara Vent came with the basket, and the situation had arrived. The sewing circle met on Thursday, as it always did, in Marta Hofer's cabin, which was the largest in the eastern section of the settlement, and which served as the gathering place for the 12 women of the Kaskaskia Bottoms community on the first and third Thursday of each month. Clara had spoken to Marta, and Marta had spoken to Hannelore Brecht, and by Thursday all 12 women came, which was unusual, the typical attendance being 8 or 9. They came because their families were burning through wet, frozen wood at rates that were not going to reach March, and because Clara Vent had told Marta Hofer in specific terms what she had found in Lena's woodshed on Tuesday morning, and Marta Hofer had a nose for useful information and had communicated the specifics to the women most likely to act on them. Lena had expected 8. She had prepared for 12. She had prepared by making coffee, and by arranging 12 chairs in the circle that the sewing circle required, and by carrying to Marta's cabin the Stuttgart farming manual and her own household ledger with the 4 winters of wood consumption records, which she set on the table before people arrived. They arrived in groups of 2 and 3, stomping snow from boots, unwrapping scarves, sitting in the circle with the particular purposefulness of women who had come for a reason rather than merely for the sewing. Hannelore Brecht came in last with her daughter-in-law and looked at the ledger and the Stuttgart manual on the table and sat down without the usual pleasantries. Lena waited until everyone had coffee. Then she said, "I want to show you the woodshed. Not describe it. Show it. We will go there, and I will explain it while you are standing in it, which is how the principle becomes clear." Marta said, "In the cold." Lena said, "Briefly. 10 minutes in -8 is manageable with proper clothing, and what you will understand at the end of 10 minutes is worth the cold." They went. 12 women across the quarter-mile of January prairie from Marta's cabin to the Schubert claim, a procession that Lena understood from the outside would look somewhat extraordinary. 12 bundled women walking into a cold snap to look at a woodshed, and did not mind understanding from the outside, because what they were going to find inside was going to reframe the extraordinary. She opened the shed door and stepped inside, and 12 women followed her. She did not speak immediately. She let them arrive at their own contact with the wood, the way Clara had arrived, through their hands. Each woman, entering the shed and seeing the rows of wood, moved instinctively toward the nearest stack. Each woman reached out and touched or lifted a piece. Each woman did the same thing Clara had done, which was turn the piece in her hands and feel its weight and look at the split face. Hannelore Brecht said, "This is dry wood." Lena said, "Yes." She said, "In January." Lena said, "In any month." The shed maintains the condition the wood arrived in, which is the condition it was in after 4 months of summer drying. She explained the shed. She explained it standing inside it, with the slatted walls visible and the elevated floor visible, and the specific orientation demonstrable by the air movement they could feel through the gaps, the January air moving from west to east through the shed interior at a pace they could feel against their faces. She explained the Stuttgart manual's description of moisture cycling, which she summarized from the passage she had read so many times she could recite it from memory, and she explained the mechanism by which wood stored outside accumulated moisture through the winter freeze-thaw cycles, and she explained the specific condition of a wood pile that had been through 11 days of -8, which was ice-bonded pieces requiring an axe to separate. She said, 7 of the 12 families in this settlement are managing a wood crisis right now. I know which 7 because I have been watching since day 1 of the cold snap. 4 of the 7 will run short before March if the cold holds." The 12 women were quiet. She said, "The shed I am standing in cost $22 in lumber and hardware, which includes the elevated floor posts and the slatted boards and the door hardware. It took 11 days to build. I built it in June of 1850. Every cord of wood I have stored in it since then has been dry by September and has remained dry through the winter. I have the consumption records. The comparison is in the ledger on the table at Marta's cabin. The difference in wood consumption between what I burn and what an equivalent household burns in January and February is 40 to 50%. Hannelore Brecht was the oldest woman in the group, 63, the matriarch of the German immigrant community in the Kaskaskia Bottoms, and she was a woman whose opinion moved the community in the direction it settled in on any question that mattered. She had been the one, at the sewing circle 2 years ago, who had looked at Lena's description of the shed and said that it looked like something built in a hurry by someone who did not have the time or the materials to do it properly. She held a piece of ash in both hands. She said, "What do I need to build this?" Lena said, "Lumber for the frame and the slatted boards, which is available at the county seat for approximately $18 worth, depending on the size you need. Post hardware and door hinges, approximately $3 to $4. A compass bearing to align the shed perpendicular to the prevailing wind, which I can give you. A full day of work for the foundation posts, and 2 to 3 days for the framing and board work. The most important element is the orientation. A shed oriented incorrectly produces less than half the drying effect of a correctly oriented one." Hannelore said, "The orientation is the key thing." Lena said, "The orientation and the elevated floor and the slatted walls together are the key thing. Any one of them alone is insufficient. Together they produce a continuous, passive air movement through the wood stack that dries it to the bone in 4 months of summer weather without any maintenance." Hannelore said, "My woodpile has been chipping since the 4th. Lena said nothing. Hannelore said, "I told you 2 years ago that the shed looked incomplete." Lena said, "Yes." Hannelore said, "I was looking at the wrong thing." Lena said, "You were looking at what a woodshed is supposed to look like. This shed does not look like what a woodshed is supposed to look like because the things that make it effective are not visible from outside. The gaps look like a mistake. The elevated floor looks like a shortcut. The orientation looks like a miscalculation because the long axis runs north-south rather than east-west, like every other outbuilding on every other claim. None of these are mistakes or shortcuts or miscalculations, but they look like all three." Hannelore set the piece of ash back in the stack with a precision that was not dismissive, but respectful, the way she placed things she had handled and was returning carefully. She said, "Could you show me where to position the shed on our claim?" Lena said, "I will walk your claim with you this week." Hannelore said, "This week in -8. Lena said, "The orientation survey takes 20 minutes. The cold is not relevant to the survey." Hannelore looked at her. She was 63 years old, and she had been in the Kaskaskia bottoms for 15 years, and she had a strong and settled opinion about most things, and a willingness, which was less common, to revise those opinions when the evidence required it. She said, "The Stuttgart manual, can I borrow it?" Lena said, "I will translate the relevant chapter for you before the end of the week." The German in the original is Württemberg dialect, and some of the terms are specific to the German forestry practice of that period. I have annotated my copy with the equivalent American terms. Hannelore said, "You annotated it." Lena said, "I annotated it in 1849 when I first read it. I have been carrying the annotations around for 3 years, waiting for the sewing circle to be interested in them." This was said without bitterness, and Hannelore understood it without bitterness, and the 12 women who were standing in the woodshed in -8 understood it as the statement it was, which was the statement of a woman who had been ready and had been waiting, and who was now, on January 14th of 1852, in a position where the readiness and the waiting were the same thing. They went back to Marta's cabin, and Lena showed them the ledger. She showed them the 4 winters of consumption records, the specific comparison between her December and January numbers, and the settlement average that she had constructed from conversations and observations over the years. She showed them the 70% winter wood costs versus her own numbers, which ran at 55% of what an equivalent household burned. Marta said, "This is your 4th winter with the shed." Lena said, "3rd, full winter. I built in June of 1850, and the first stored wood went in September 1850 for the winter of 1850 to 1851. Marta said, "You have 3 winters of comparison data." Lena said, "Yes. November and December show 25 to 30% savings versus the settlement average. January and February show 40 to 50%. The savings increase as the winter progresses, because outdoor wet wood gets wetter as the winter progresses, while shed wood maintains its condition. Marta said, "And you have told no one." Lena said, "I told the sewing circle in September 1850, and again in March 1851, and again in September 1851. Marta was quiet. Lena said, "The sewing circle told me the shed looked cheap." Marta said, "I said that." Lena said, "Yes." Marta said, "I will not repeat that specific mistake." Lena said, "I know. That is why I asked Clara to bring you to the shed." There was a pause in which the room absorbed the fact that Lena had staged the sequence of conversations precisely as they had unfolded, which was a demonstration of a kind of patient intelligence that the sewing circle appreciated and occasionally found unsettling. Hannelore said, "How many sheds can you design for the settlement this summer?" Lena said, "I can walk any claim and site any shed in 20 minutes. The design is the same for every site except the orientation, which depends on the specific prevailing wind at each location. Some of the western claims are more sheltered, and the wind direction is deflected by the creek timber. I would need to spend half an hour on each of those." She said, "How many families will commit to building this summer?" Lena looked at the 12 women. She said, "That is a question for the 12 of you, not for me. I'm prepared to help any family that wants to build correctly. The question is, how many families will commit to the work before the summer when the work is easy, rather than in the next cold snap when the work is urgent?" Hannelore said, "I commit for our family today." Clara Wendt said, "We commit. Wilhelm will build what I tell him to build this month. He has been chipping frozen wood for 2 weeks. He is persuadable." Marta said, "Commit for us." By the end of Thursday's sewing circle, 9 of the 12 Kaskaskia Bottoms families had committed to building properly oriented drying sheds before the summer cutting season. The other 3 were the 3 whose husbands Clara and Hannelore and Marta said they would talk to before Sunday. By Sunday, 12 families had committed. The conversation Clara had with Wilhelm Wendt after the sewing circle was a conversation she had been preparing for, without knowing it, since the January morning she spent 20 minutes in Lena's shed, holding bone-dry wood in -8 air. It was not a difficult conversation. Wilhelm Wendt had been chipping frozen wood with an axe every morning for 13 days when his wife told him that there was a shed design that would prevent exactly that problem, and that they were going to build it in June. He said, "Which neighbor has this shed?" Clara said, "Lena Schubert." He said, "The woman with the odd woodshed." Clara said, "The woman with the shed that held 7 cords of dry wood through 13 days of -8. Our woodpile has been chipping since day 4. He was quiet. She said, "She walked my claim on Saturday and identified the position for our shed. It is 20 feet north of the cabin. Long axis running north-south, open slatted walls east and west. The materials are approximately $22 from the county seat. Gerhard Schubert can loan us the design details." He said, "You already walked the claim." She said, "I walked the claim on Saturday, yes." He was quiet for a moment longer. He said, "June." She said, "June. Before the first summer cutting." He said, "All right." He said this the way a practical man said a thing that was inevitable and sensible and slightly ahead of where his pride would have preferred to arrive, and Clara accepted it in the spirit it was offered, which was the spirit of a man who had been chipping frozen wood for 2 weeks and was capable of learning from the experience. The spring of 1852 brought the construction work that the January conversations had generated. Gerhard Schubert came home in April and found his wife had committed to helping 11 families design and build drying sheds over the course of the summer. A commitment he absorbed with the equanimity of a man who had been married to Lena for 9 years and understood her capacity for systematic work. He said, "All 11 families." She said, "12, if you count our own. Ours is already built." He said, "Ours is already built." She said, "Ours was built in June of 1850, yes." You have been sleeping in the same cabin as it for 3 summers. I wanted to show you the ledger comparison when you came home. But you came home in August, and by August, the most recent comparison data was not available yet. He said, the most recent comparison was January. She said, January and February are the months when the comparison is most significant. He said, and I am away in January. She said, yes. He looked at the ledger she had opened on the table, the 4 winters of records, the consumption columns, the comparison numbers. He said, 42% lower in January. She said, this past January, 3 winters averaged 38% in January. He said, you've been doing this alone. She said, the design is from the Stuttgart manual. I understood it from reading. I executed it in June of 1850 while you were on the road. I have not done it alone in the sense of inventing it. He said, you executed it alone. She said, yes. He said, 11 families this summer. She said, 12. I would like you to help with the framing on the families where the husband is less experienced with construction work. The orientation and the floor elevation and the board spacing are straightforward once you understand them, but the framing sequence benefits from someone who has built correctly once and can show the next person directly. He said, and I have built correctly once. She said, you will have built correctly once by the end of this week when we rebuild the east wall of our shed with the tighter board spacing I have been meaning to address since 1850. He laughed, which was not the response she had anticipated, but which was the response she appreciated because it told her he understood the situation fully and was choosing to find it funny rather than uncomfortable. He said, show me the east wall. She showed him the east wall. They rebuilt it together on a Saturday afternoon in April, replacing the boards where the spacing had crept slightly too wide on the bottom 2 courses, which Lena had been noting in the ledger since 1851 as a small inefficiency in the precipitation management that she had not yet corrected. Gerhard looked at the spacing as she described the problem and said, the snow came in at the bottom. She said, on heavy, wind-driven snow days, yes, the top courses shed it. The bottom 2 let it through because the gap is 4 inches where it should be 2. He said, 2-inch gap, 4-inch board. She said, yes, equal dimension gap and board at the bottom, graduating to slightly wider gap at the top, where you want more airflow through the upper wood and less precipitation risk, because the upper wood is protected by the overhang. He said, you designed a precipitation gradient. She said, I designed a ventilation gradient. The precipitation management is a consequence of the same geometry. He looked at her for a moment with the expression he had worn periodically across 9 years of marriage, the expression of a man who was capable of building and fixing almost anything, and who had periodically recognized that his wife was the one who understood why a thing should be built. He said, I'll show the families in June. She said, I'll show the families in June. You'll show them in June too. 2 teachers are better than 1 when the material is spatial. She had drawn the construction plans during the winter, 12 separate plans for 12 separate sites, each adjusted for the specific orientation and the specific prevailing wind she had determined from her Saturday afternoon site surveys, which she had conducted in the January and February cold, with the compass and the small wind direction gauge she had made from a weighted string tied to a willow switch, which showed wind direction precisely and cost nothing. The plans were in a folder on the shelf above the household ledger, organized by family name, each plan with a cover sheet that listed the materials required, the construction sequence, and the 3 things she had identified as the most common errors in the construction of this type of shed, which were incorrect orientation, insufficient floor elevation, and board spacing that was consistent across the full wall height, rather than graduated. She had written the 3 common errors in August of 1851, after she had thought through what someone building this shed for the first time would most likely get wrong. She had thought about it the way her father had thought about cooperage errors, by imagining the inexperienced person encountering each step of the construction and identifying where the inexperience was most likely to express itself. Her father had said, "The most important thing a craftsman can know is what the person who learned badly did wrong. You learn what to do from success. You learn what not to do from failure." The craft is having both. She had both. She had 4 winters of records that showed what she had done right. She had spent the winter imagining what 11 other families might do wrong and had written the 3 most likely errors on the cover sheets of their folders. The construction happened through June and July, with Gerhard doing the framing and Lena doing the orientation work and the board spacing and the floor elevation, which was the detail work that required the precision she had developed over 3 years of observing her own shed's performance. The vent shed went up first because Wilhelm Wendt had been chipping ice for 13 days in January and had the most to say about it. He was an adequate carpenter, and with Gerhard's direction and Lena's board spacing specifications, he built a shed in 3 days that was correctly oriented and correctly elevated and correctly spaced. He tested the orientation himself on the first day by standing in the frame before any walls were on it and holding his hand up to the southwest wind and then checking his compass bearing and finding the bearing matched what Lena had specified to within 2 degrees. He said to Lena, 2 degrees. She said, 2 degrees is acceptable. The wind is not linear. You will have northwest wind on some days and west wind on others. The perpendicular to the mean prevailing direction is the target, not the perpendicular to any single day's wind. He said, I understand. He built the walls that afternoon. The summer cutting went into the new sheds as fast as they were built, and by September of 1852, 10 of the 12 sheds were holding freshly cut wood from the creek-bottom timber, the green oak and ash and hickory that would spend the summer and fall months drawing its moisture through the precisely spaced slatted walls in the continuous airflow that the orientations and the floor elevations and the graduated spacings collectively produced. Lena walked each shed in September, checking the wood condition with the thumbnail test, and found consistent results across all 10 completed sheds. The wood in the earliest filled sheds, the vent shed and the brecht shed, showed the dry split-face color and the dry thumbnail impression that her own shed's wood had been showing for 3 years. The wood in the last 3 filled had not had enough summer time to reach that condition and would be wet through early winter, but would dry through the late summer warmth that October typically provided and would be genuinely dry by January. She wrote this in the household ledger and added a note that she intended to check the comparison data again in January and February of the winter of 1852 to 1853. Which would be the first full winter of multiple comparable sheds in the settlement, and which would allow her to compare the consumption rates of the 12 new shed families against the settlement families who had not built new sheds, which was a more rigorous comparison than the previous year's comparison between her own consumption and the settlement average. She got the comparison data. The winter of 1852 to 1853 was not as cold as the previous winter, but it was a standard Illinois Territory winter with 3 significant cold snaps and a February that ran below 0 for a week. The 12 families with drying sheds collectively burned 36% less wood from January through March than the comparable previous year. The 4 families who had not built sheds maintained their previous consumption rates. 36% was the number she wrote in the ledger, and the number that Gerhard brought to the county seat's Agricultural Society meeting in March, where he described the shed design and offered to provide plans to any farming family in the county who wanted them. The County Agricultural Society published a description of the shed design in its annual proceedings for 1853. The description was attributed to Gerhard Schubert of the Kaskaskia Bottom Settlement. Lena read the proceedings when the copy arrived at the settlement and noted that her name did not appear in the description, which was a consequence of the agricultural society being a society of male farmers who talked to Gerhard rather than to Lena, and who assumed that the farmer's wife had not been the originating intelligence of the farmer's contribution. She mentioned this to Gerhard. He said, "I told them it was your design." She said, "I know you did. They described it as your design." He said, "I will write a correction." She said, "Write a correction. It matters that the record is accurate." He wrote the correction, and it was published in the following year's proceedings, which credited the design to Lena Schubert of the Kaskaskia Bottom settlement and cited the Stuttgart Farming Manual as the original source for the principles, and cited Lena's 4 years of practical development and record-keeping as the demonstration that the principles worked under Illinois Territory conditions. She read this with the satisfaction of accuracy rather than the satisfaction of credit. The distinction was important to her. Credit was pleasant but transient. Accuracy was permanent. The Stuttgart Manual's author, whose name was Johann Hoffmann, and who had died in 1841 without knowing his manual, would be read by an immigrant woman in Illinois Territory who would apply his principles more systematically than anyone he had written for, did not receive a correction. The proceedings did not extend to German forestry scientists who had died 11 years prior to publication. Lena thought about this occasionally, in the evenings, when she was alone in the cabin in October, and the shed outside the window was full of properly dried wood ready for the winter. She thought, Johann Hoffmann wrote what he knew about wood and airflow and temperature and moisture, and I read it and understood it and applied it, and 12 families in the Kaskaskia Bottom settlement are warm in January because of the chain of understanding from Württemberg to Illinois. She thought about this without philosophy or sentiment. It was simply a useful thing to know, and knowing was the thing that connected the chain. Gerhard came home each April and went to the mill circuit each May, and came home each August, and went back to the mills each September, and came home at last each November. And each November Lena showed him the shed condition and the ledger entries from the months he had been away, and they sat together in the evenings with the records between them, checking her estimates against the actual numbers, which were usually within 3% of the estimates, and sometimes closer. He said once, in the November of 1854, after looking at the records for the 4th time, "Do you know what I have been thinking about while I was on the road this summer?" She said, "The millstone dressing on the Harmon mill." He said, "Yes, and also this. I have been thinking about what you do in the months I am away, the records you keep and the people you help, and the way the shed has changed how 12 families spend their winter. I have been thinking that there is a version of this winter where you were not here, or where you had not read the Stuttgart Manual, or where you had heard what Hannelore Brecht said about the shed, and believed it, and built the standard lean-to that everyone else built." She said, "What is the version where I heard Hannelore and believed her?" He said, "The version where 12 families chip frozen wood every January for the rest of their winters in the Kaskaskia Bottoms." She said, "I heard Hannelore. I did not believe her." He said, "No." She said she was looking at the gaps in the wall and concluding that the gaps were a failure. "I was looking at the gaps and knowing they were the point." He said, "The gaps were the point." She said, "The gaps are always the point. Every design that works looks like a mistake to someone who has not read the manual." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Whose manual do you need to read to understand the thing you do not yet understand?" She said, "That is the question I ask myself in October when I have time to think." He said, "What is your October answer this year?" She thought for a moment. She said, "The efficiency of the stacking pattern inside the shed. The Stuttgart Manual describes the alternating cross-stack pattern, the crisscross method, as more effective than parallel rows for airflow. I have been stacking in parallel rows because it is faster. I believe I am leaving efficiency on the table." He said, You want to change the stacking pattern. She said, I want to test both patterns in the same shed next summer and compare the drying rate at the end of September. I will need to divide the shed with a temporary board partition and stack one half each way and use the thumbnail test on both halves in August and September to see which is ahead. He said, You want to run an experiment? She said, I have been running experiments since 1849. This is the next one. He looked at her. He said, You're never finished. She said, The shed is finished. The improvement of the shed is not finished. The shed is not the point. Understanding the shed is the point. He said, Understanding is the point. She said, Correct application of understanding is the point. Understanding without application is the Stuttgart Manual, sitting on a shelf in 1849 in an Illinois Territory farmhouse. He said, And application without understanding is a shed with gaps in the walls that looks cheap. She said, And that is why both are necessary, and why neither is the point alone, and why the chain from Württemberg to Illinois requires each link. They sat with the records in the November cabin, and the shed outside held its condition in the cold, and the wood in it was dry and would remain dry through the winter and would burn at 40% greater efficiency than the wet wood in the settlement's standard lean-to stacks, which would freeze and chip and hiss and fall behind the cold and require more cuts and more hauling and more work for worse results. This was what Lena Schubert had built in June of 1850 and had been building since. Not the shed, which was $22 of lumber and 3 days of work, but the understanding of the shed, which was 4 winters of records and 3 September explanations that had not worked, and one January morning when Clara Wendt arrived with a basket and discovered that the cheap shed with the gaps in the walls had kept 7 cords bone dry through 11 days of -8, while the settlement's solid-walled lean-tos had produced frozen blocks requiring an axe. Understanding was not the point. The right understanding, applied correctly, at the right moment, with the patience to wait for the January that said what September could not say, was the point. She had it. She had built the patience into the records, the way she had built the airflow into the gaps. Both were invisible. Both were necessary. Both were the point. If this story changed how you think about the kind of patience that builds something useful and waits for the winter to explain it, hit that like button now and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. And I want to know this. Have you ever built something that looked wrong to other people because the thing that made it right was invisible from outside? Because that is this story, and it is the frontier story, and it is every craftsman's story. Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. The Schubert shed remained standing at the Kaskaskia Bottoms claim until 1879, when the family who bought the property after Gerhard's death replaced it with a larger structure that incorporated the same principles, the same orientation and elevated floor, and graduated slatted walls, because by 1879 those principles were standard practice for woodsheds in the Kaskaskia Bottoms settlement and had been standard practice since 1852, transmitted by the 12 families who had built in June of that year and by the Agricultural Society proceedings, and by the simple efficiency of a design that worked and kept working year after year until the people who used it no longer knew that there had been a time when anyone built differently. Lena Schubert moved to Indianapolis in 1871 to live near her youngest daughter after Gerhard died at the mills. She carried the household ledger with her and kept it until her death in 1882. Her granddaughter found it in 1882 and read it and understood from the records that her grandmother had kept 4 decades of wood consumption data and had spent 3 years waiting for the settlement to be cold enough to listen to what she already knew. She put the ledger in the trunk where she kept things that should not be lost. It was there in 1901, when the trunk was opened, and there in 1923, when the trunk was passed to Lena's great-granddaughter, and there in 1941, when the ledger was donated to the Kaskaskia Valley Historical Society, where it still is. The wood consumption entries for January and February 1852 are the clearest in the book, written with the particular care of someone who had been waiting to write those numbers for a long time and wanted to write them correctly. The split face of bone-dry ash in -8 air, the comparison with the frozen pile outside the cabin wall, 4 winters and 1 January morning, and the sewing circle that arrived at the shed with 12 women and left with the understanding that the gaps in the walls were the point. She had always known the gaps were the point. She had waited for them to see it.